Okay, so the last thing that I want to talk about in terms of sequences are talking about bounded sequences. And let's start with a definition. Okay, so a sequence A sub n is bounded if two things need to happen. One, it needs to be bounded from above. Okay. And this means there exists a finite number, let's call that number m, such that m is greater than or equal to any a sub n term for all n. Okay, so for any number in your sequence, m is larger than, greater than, or equal to that number. So that's what it means to be bounded from above. And okay, so to be bounded, so I'm putting an and here because in order for a sequence to be bounded, it needs to be bounded from above and bounded from below. And so it's bounded from below if there exists a finite number let's call that little m, such that our little m is less than or equal to a sub n. Okay. And okay, so it's bounded. It's bounded. The sequence is bounded. It has to be bounded. For a sequence to be bounded, it has to be bounded from above and below. If, so this is just a note, if a sub n is not bounded, sorry for trying to write as neat as possible on this iPad, is not bounded above and below, then it is an unbounded sequence. Okay. So now, keep in mind it has to be bounded above and below. Okay, so now we're going to take a look at some sequences and determine whether they're bounded or unbounded. So our first example, let's see, will be let a sub n equal 1 over n plus 1, the sequence 1 over n plus 1, where n is 1, 2, 3, dot, dot, dot. Okay. All right, so one way to look at this in determining whether it's bounded above and below is to just, let's look at some of our first few terms of the sequence. All right, since we're starting with 1, then our first term would be a half, and then we would have a third, and then we have a fourth, and dot, dot, dot. Okay. So we can see that we are bounded below by 0, right? Because there, since, let me put that since, and since 0 is less than or equal to any value in our sequence, right? Because it goes from 1 to infinity. Okay. So none of our values, so all our values are larger than 0. Keep in mind too that when we're talking about numbers bounding our sequence, it doesn't just need to be one, it can be more than one answer to this. So if I ask you for a question, give me a number that bounds the sequence below, 0 is a number, but also you could have gave me -1, -2. Those are also valid answers. So I just picked 0 because it's sort of clear to see that 0 definitely bounds this below because none of the terms are, all the terms are greater than 0. Now, to determine whether we're bounded above, it might take a little more work. Some of you can see that, is there a number that is larger than, that our sequence, basically bounded above means there's a number that our sequence will never get to. It might approach it, but it'll never get to, and so it's bounded above. Well, in order to determine whether it's bounded above, we can take the limit of our sequence, because we know if the limit of our sequence converges or stops at some value, that any value above that number will bound it above. Okay, and so the limit, I'll do it here, as n goes to infinity of 1 over n plus 1, well, as n goes to infinity, our sequence is going to 0. So these terms, and we can tell these terms are getting, let me highlight it a little, these terms here are getting smaller. So we know that those terms are actually converting to 0. So we can say that it's bounded above by any number larger than 0. Well, let's just say, well, no, let me rephrase. We know that those numbers are going to 0. So we can say it's bounded above by 1, right? Okay. Because we can't say it's any number larger than 0, because a half is larger than 0 and a half is in that sequence and it's greater than 0. So it's bounded by 1. It'll never go over 1. Okay, and or you could actually say it's bounded, and we'll talk about this a little later. It's also bounded above by a half, since remember from the definition, it can be equal to a number in our sequence as long as that's the largest number. And it's actually bounded above by a half as well. So like I said, you can have more than one answer. And I'll stop this recording.